Hello everybody. If you're here listening to the sounds of my voice, that means I'm going to be reading to you Aztec by Gary Jennings. This is part 2 of the audiobook, so if you haven't listened to part 1, go ahead and do so. And as usual, this book is dedicated to Zayanya, but I would also like to dedicate this audiobook to Susan Martin, without whose very nice comments I may not be here today for episode 2. So without further ado, we have another letter from the Spaniards that I'm currently flipping to. Here we go. Sanctified, Caesarian, Catholic Majesty, the Emperor Don Carlos, our Lord King. May the serene and beneficent light of our Lord Jesus Christ shine everlastingly upon your Majesty Don Carlos, divinely appointed Emperor, etc., etc. Most August Majesty, from this city of Mexico, capital of New Spain, this eve of the feast of Saint Michael and all angels, in the year of our Lord 1529, greeting. Your Majesty commands that we continue to send additional portions of the so-called Aztec history as quickly as the pages are compiled. This grievously astounds and offends your well-intentioned chaplain, sire. We would not, for all the realms in your Majesty's domain, dream of disputing our sovereign's desires and decisions. But we thought we had made plain in our earlier letter our objections to this chronicle, which grows daily more detestable, and we hoped that the recommendation of your Majesty's own delegated bishop would not be so casually disdained. We are cognizant of your gracious Majesty's concern for the most minute information regarding even the most remote of your subjects, that you may the more wisely and beneficently govern them. Indeed, we have respected that praiseworthy concern ever since the very first task to which your Majesty personally set us, the extermination of the witches of Navarre. That once dissident province has been, since the sublime and prodigious purging by fire, among the most obedient and subservient of all under your Majesty's sovereignty. Your humble servant intends equal assiduity in rooting out the age-old evils of these newer provinces, putting the curb rein to vice and the spurs to virtue, thus bringing them likewise to submission to your Majesty and the Holy Cross. Surely nothing can be undertaken in your Majesty's service which will not be blessed by God. And, of a certainty, your most puissant lordship should know of matters regarding this land, for it is so limitless and marvelous that your Majesty may well call yourself Emperor of it with no less pride than you do of Germany, which, by the grace of God, is now also your Majesty's possession. Nevertheless, in supervising the transcription of this history of what is now New Spain, only God knows how racked and outraged and nauseated we have been by the narrator's unquenchable affliction. The Aztec is an Aeolus with an inexhaustible bag of winds. We could not complain of that if he confined himself to what we have asked, that is, an account in the manner of St. Gregory of Tours and other classical historians. Names of distinguished personages, brief summaries of their careers, prominent dates, places, battles, etc. But this human cataract cannot be restrained from his divagations into the most sordid and repellent aspects of his people's history and his own. Granted, this Indian was a heathen until his baptism no more than a few years ago. The infernal atrocities he committed and witnessed in his earlier life we must charitably concede were done or condoned in ignorance of Christian morality. Still, he is now at least nominally a Christian. One would expect him, if he must dwell on the more bestial episodes of his life and times, to manifest a decent and humble contrition befitting the horrors he describes in such lascivious detail. He does not. He recognizes no horror in these enormities. He does not so much as blush at the many offenses to our Lord and the common decency which he is dinning into the ears of our reverend friar scribes. Idolatry, pretense of magic, superstitions, bloodthirst and bloodletting, obscene and unnatural acts, other sins so vile that we here forbear even to name them. Except for your Majesty's command that all be set forth in much detail, we would not allow our scribes to commit portions of the Aztec's narrative to the permanence of parchment. However, your Majesty's servant has never yet disobeyed a royal order. We will try to regard the Indian's pernicious maunderings merely as evidence that during his lifetime the adversary arranged many sorts of temptations and trials for him, God permitting it for the stoutening of the Aztec's soul. This, we remind ourselves, is no small evidence of the greatness of God, for he chooses not the wise and strong, but the simple-minded and weak, to be equally instruments and beneficiaries of his mercy. The law of God, we remind ourselves, obliges us to extend an extra meed of tolerance to those upon whose lips the milk of the faith is not yet dry, rather than to those who have already absorbed it and are accustomed to it. So, we will try to contain our disgust. We will keep the Indian with us and let him continue to spew his sewage, at least until we hear of your Majesty's response to these further pages of his story. Fortunately, we have no other urgent need for his 5 attendants at this time. The creature's only recompense is that we allow him a share of our simple fare, and a straw sleeping mat in an unused store closet off the cloister, for his use on those nights when he does not take our table scraps to his apparently alien wife, and spend the night ministering to her. But we are confident that we shall soon be rid of the Aztec and the foul miasma which we feel surrounding him. We know that when you read the following pages, sire, indescribably more horripilating than the previous portion, you will share our revulsion, and will cry, "No more of this filth," much as David cried, "Publish it not, lest the unbelievers rejoice." We will eagerly, nay, anxiously, await your esteemed Majesty's command for the next courier ship, that all pages compiled in the meantime be destroyed, and that we oust this reprehensible barbarian from our precincts. May God our Lord watch over and preserve your most excellent Majesty for many years in his holy service. Of your SCCM, the loyal and prayerful chaplain, Zumaraga. I'll dab to that. Here's to obscene and unnatural acts. So before we get into the meat of this section, I just want to say, feel free to discuss your thoughts in the comments. I'll try and get in there too for this starting this episode. Let's just try and keep our discussion limited to the events that actually happened in this episode, because we don't want to spoil it for other people. So yeah. Okay, here we go. His Excellency does not attend today, my Lord Scribes. Am I to continue then? Ah, I see. He will read your pages of my words at his leisure. Very well. Then let me leave for now my overly personal chronicle of my family and myself, lest you get the impression that I and the few other persons I have mentioned lived in some kind of isolation, apart from the rest of humanity. Let me give you a broader view. In my mind, in my recollection, I shall step back and away, so to speak, that I may better make you see our relation to our world as a whole. The world we called Chem Anahuac, meaning the one world. Your explorers early discovered that it is situated between two boundless oceans, east and west. The humid hot lands at the ocean's edges extend not far inland before they slant upward to become towering mountain ranges, with a high plateau between those eastern and western ranges. This plateau is so near the sky that the air is thin and clean and sparkling clear. Our days here are almost always springtime mild, even during the midsummer rainy season, until the dry winter comes, when Tititl, god of the year's shortest days, chooses to make some of those days chilly or even achingly cold. The most populous part of all the one world is this great bowl or depression in the plateau, which you now call the Valley of Mexico. Here are puddled the lakes that made this area so attractive to human habitation. In actuality, there is only one tremendous lake, pinched in two places by encroaching highlands, so that there are three large bodies of water connected by slightly narrower straits. The smallest and southernmost of these lakes is of fresh water, fed by clear streams melting from the snows of the mountains there. The northernmost lake, where I spent my earliest years, is of reddish and briny water, because it is surrounded by mineral lands which leach their salts into the water. The central lake, Texcoco, bigger than the other two together, and composed of their mingled salty and fresh waters, is thus of a slightly brackish quality. Despite there being only one lake, or three, if you like, we have always divided them by 5 names. The dun-colored Lake Texcoco alone bears a single name. The southern and most crystalline lake is called Xochimilco in its upper part, the flower garden, because that neighborhood is the nursery of precious plants for all the lands about. In its lower part, the lake is called Chalco, after the Chalca nation which borders it. The northernmost lake, though also a single body of water, is likewise divided. The people who live on Sumpanco, the skull-shaped island, call its upper half Lake Sumpanco. The people of my native Shantikan, island of field mice, call their portion Lake Shantikan. In a sense, I might liken these lakes to our gods, our former gods. I have heard you Christians complain of our multitudes of gods and goddesses, who held dominion over every facet of nature and of human behavior. I have heard you complain that you never can sort out and understand the workings of our crowded pantheon. However, I have counted and compared. I do not believe that we relied on so many major and minor deities as you do. The Lord God, the Son Jesus, the Holy Ghost, the Virgin Mary, plus all those other higher beings you call angels and apostles and saints, each of them the governing patron of some single facet of your world, your lives, your Tenotin, even every single day in the calendar. In truth, I believe we recognized fewer deities, but we charged each of ours with more diverse functions. To a geographer, there is but one lake here in the valley. To a boatman laboriously paddling his alkali, there are 3 broad bodies of water, interconnected. To the people who live on or around the lakes, there are 5, distinguished by separate names. Just so, no one of our gods and goddesses had but one face, one responsibility, one name. Like our lake of 3 lakes, a single god might embody a trinity of aspects. That makes you scowl, Reverend Friars? Very well. A god might have 2 aspects, or 5, or 20. Depending on the time of year, wet season or dry, long days or short, planting time or harvest time, and depending on circumstances, wartime or peacetime, feast or famine, kind rulers or cruel. A single god's duties would vary, and so would his attitude toward us, and so would our mode of worshipping or celebrating or placating him. To look at it another way, our lives and harvests and battle triumphs or failures might depend on the temperament and transient moods of the god. He could be, like the three lakes, bitter or sweet or blandly indifferent, as he chose. Meanwhile, both the god's prevailing mood and the current happenings in our world could be differently viewed by different followers of that god. A victory for one army is a defeat for another. Is that not so? Thus the god or goddess might be simultaneously regarded as rewarding and punishing, demanding and giving, doing good and evil. If you grasp all the infinite possible combinations of circumstances, you should be able to comprehend the variety of attributes we saw in every god, the variety of aspects each assumed, and the even greater variety of names we gave each of them: worshipful, respectful, grateful, fearful. But I will not belabor this. Let me come back from the mystic to the physical. I will speak of things demonstrable to the five senses that even brute animals possess. The island of Shantikan is really a gigantic, almost solid rock, set well out from the mainland in the salty red lake. If it were not for 3 natural springs of fresh water bubbling up from the rock, the island would never have been populated. But in my time, it supported perhaps 2,000 people distributed among 20 villages. And the rock was our support in more than one sense, for it was 10-inch limestone, a valuable commodity. In its natural state, this form of limestone is quite soft and easily quarried, even with our crude tools of wood, stone, blunt copper, and brittle obsidian, so inferior to yours of iron and steel. My father was a master quarrier, one of several who directed the less expert workers. I remember one of the occasions when he took me to his quarry for instruction in his trade. "You cannot see them," he told me, "but here and here run the natural fissures and striations of this particular stratum of the stone. Though they are invisible to the untrained eye, you will learn to divine them." I never would, but he never ceased hoping. I watched while he marked the face of the stone with dabs of black ochito. Other workers came. They were pale with sweat-caked dust, to hammer wooden wedges into the minute cracks he had marked. Then they sloshed water over the wedges. We went home, and some days passed, during which the workers kept those wedges well sodden, so they would swell and exert increasing pressure inside the stone. Then my father and I went again to the quarry. We stood on the brink of it and looked down. My father said, "Watch now." The stone might have been awaiting his presence and permission, for all of a sudden and all of its own accord, the quarry face gave a rending noise and split apart. Some of it came tumbling ponderously down in immense cubic chunks. Other parts peeled off in flat square sheets, and they all fell intact into rope nets spread to receive them before they smashed on the quarry floor. We went down, and my father inspected them with satisfaction. "Only a little dressing with adzes," he said, "a little polishing with a slurry of powdered obsidian and water, and these," he pointed to the limestone cubes, "will be perfect building blocks, while these The sheets as big as our house floor and as thick as my arm will be panels of facing. I rubbed the surface of one of the blocks, waist high to myself. It felt both waxy and powdery. "Oh, they are too soft for any use when they first come loose from the mother stone," said my father. He ran his thumbnail across the block, and it scarred a deep scratch. "After some while of exposure to the open air, they solidify. They become as strong and imperishable as granite. But our stone, while it is still malmy and workable, can be carved with any harder stone, or cut with an obsidian grit sawing stream. Most of our island's limestone was freighted to the mainland or to the capital for use as buildings' walls and floors and ceilings. But because of the fresh stone's easy workability, there were also sculptors busy at the quarries. Those artists chose the finest quality blocks, and while they were still soft, sculptured them into statues of our gods, rulers, and other heroes. The most perfect limestone sheets they carved into low-relief lintels and friezes with which to decorate temples and palaces. Also, using leftover chunks of stone, the artists carved the little household gods treasured by families everywhere. In our house we had small figures of Tenatio and Tlaloc, of course, and of the maize goddess, Chico-Micotl, and the hearth goddess, Chantico. My sister Tsitsi even had her own private figurine of Xochiquetzal, goddess of love and flowers, to whom all young girls prayed for a suitable and loving husband. The stone chips and other detritus from the quarries were burned in the kilns I have mentioned, from which emerged powder of lime, another valuable commodity. This is essential for the mortar used to cement the building's blocks together. It also makes a gesso for plastering and disguising buildings made of cheaper materials. Mixed with water, the lime is used for hulling the kernels of maize that our women grind into meal for Tlaxcaltan tortillas and other foods. The lime was even used by a certain class of women as a cosmetic. With it they bleached their black or brown hair to an unnatural yellow hue, like that of some of your own women. Of course, the gods give nothing absolutely free of payment, and from time to time they exacted tribute from us for the wealth of limestone we dug out of Shantikan. I happened to be at my father's quarry on a day when the gods decided to take a token sacrifice. A number of porters were hauling a tremendous block of new-cut stone up from the lawn incline, like a curving shelf that spiraled from the bottom of the quarry to the top. They did it by sheer muscle power, with a tump line around each man's forehead attached to the rope net that dragged the block. Somewhere high up on that ramp, the block slid too close to the edge, or was tilted by some irregularity in the path. Whatever happened, it slowly and implacably fell sideways. There was much shouting, and if the porters had not instantly ripped the tump lines from their heads, they would have gone over the brink with the block. But one man, far below in the noise of the quarry, did not hear the shouts. The block came down upon him, and one of its edges, like a stone adze, chopped him precisely in half at his waist. The limestone block had gouged such a deep notch in the quarry floor that it stayed there, balanced on its angular edge. So my father and the other man who rushed to the spot were able without much difficulty to topple it to one side. They found, to their astonishment, that the victim of the gods was still alive, and even conscious. Unnoticed in the excitement, I came close and saw the man, who was now in two places. From the waist up, his naked and sweaty body was intact and unmarked, but his waist was pinched wide and flat, so his torso itself rather resembled an adze or a chisel. The stone had simultaneously severed him, skin, flesh, guts, spine, and neatly closed the wound so that there was not even a drop of blood spilt. He might have been a cotton doll that had been sliced across the middle, then sewn at the cut. His bottom half, still wearing its loincloth, lay separated from him, neatly pinched shut and bloodless, though the legs were twitching slightly, and that half of the body was copiously urinating and defecating. The massive injury must have so deadened all the cut nerves that the man even felt no pain. He raised his head and looked in mild wonder at himself in two halves. To spare him the sight, the other men quickly and tenderly carried him, the upper half of him, some distance away, and leaned him against the quarry wall. He flexed his arms, opened and closed his hands, experimentally turned his head about, and said in a voice of awe, "I still can move and talk. I see you all, my comrades. I can reach out and touch and feel you. I hear the hewing of tools. I smell the bitter dust of lime. I still live. This is a most marvelous thing." "It is," my father said gruffly, "but it cannot be for long. Shikama, there is no use even sending for a physician. You will want a priest. Of which god, Shikama?" The man thought for a moment. "I can soon greet all the gods, when I can no longer do anything else. But while I still can speak, I had better talk to Filtheater." So the call was relayed to the top of the quarry, and from there a runner sped to fetch a priest of the goddess Tlazolteotl, or Filtheater. Her unlovely name notwithstanding, she was a most compassionate goddess. It was to her that dying men confessed all their sins and misdeeds, quite often living men, too, when they felt particularly distressed or depressed by something they had done, so that Tlazolteotl might swallow their sins, and those sins would disappear as if they had never been committed. Thus they did not go with a man, to count against him or to haunt his memory, in whatever afterworld he was headed for. While we waited for the priest, Shikama kept his eyes averted from himself, where his body appeared to be squeezed into a cleft of the rock floor, and spoke calmly, almost cheerfully, to my father. He gave him messages to impart to his parents, to his widow and orphan children, and made suggestions as to their disposition of what little property he owned, and wondered aloud what his family would do when its provider was gone. "Do not trouble your mind," said my father. "It is your Tenali that the gods take you in exchange for the prosperity of us who remain. In thanks for your sacrifice of yourself, we and the Lord Governor will make suitable compensation to your widow. Then she will have a respectable inheritance," said Shikama, relieved. "And she is still a young and handsome woman. Please, head nodder, prevail on her to marry again." "I will do that. Is there anything else?" "No," said Shikama. He looked about him and smiled. "I never thought I would regret seeing the last of this dreary quarry. Do you know, head nodder, even this stone pit looks beautiful and inviting now. The white clouds up there, then the blue sky, then the white stone here, like clouds above and below the blue. I wish, though, I could see the green trees beyond the rim. You will, my father promised, but after you have finished with the priest. We had better not chance moving you until then. The priest came, in all his black of flapping black robes and blood-crusted black hair and never-washed, sooty face. He was the only darkness and gloom that marred the clean blue and white of which Shikama was sorry to take leave. All the other men moved away to give them privacy, and my father espied me among them, and angrily bade me be gone. That was no sight for a young boy. While Shikama was occupied with the priest, 4 men picked up his stinking and still quivering lower half to carry it up to the top of the quarry. One of them vomited along the way. Shikama evidently had led no very villainous life. It did not take him long to confess to filth eater whatever he regretted having done or left undone. When the priest had absolved him on behalf of the goddess, and had said all the ritual words and made all the ritual gestures, he stood away. 4 more men carefully picked up the still living part of Shikama and carried him, as rapidly as they could without jostling, up the incline toward the quarry rim. It was hoped that he would go on living long enough to reach his village and say his own farewell to his family, and pay his respects to whatever gods he had personally preferred. But somewhere along the upward spiraling ramp, his pinched body began to gape, to leak his blood and his breakfast and various other substances. He ceased speaking and breathing, and closed his eyes, and he never did get to see the green trees again. Some of the limestone of Shantikan had long ago gone into the construction of our islands Ikpak, Plamanakali, and Tenakaltan, or as you call them, our pyramid and several temples. A share of all the stone quarried was always set aside for taxes we paid to the nation's treasury, and for our annual tribute to the Reverend Speaker and his speaking council. The Yue Tlatoani Motekuzoma had died when I was 3, and in that year the rule and throne had passed to his son Axayakano, Waterface. Another share of the stone was reserved to the profit of our Tekutli, or governor, to some other ranking nobles, and to the island's expenses. Building canoes for water freighting, buying slaves to do the dirtier work, paying quarry wages, and the like. But there was still much of our mineral product left over for export and barter. That earned for Shantikan imported trade goods and negotiable trade currency, which are acutely shared out among his subjects, according to their status and merit. Furthermore, he allowed all the island people, except of course the slaves and other low classes, to build their houses of the handy limestone. Thus, Shantikan differed from most other communities in these lands, where the houses were more often built of sun-dried mud brick, or wood, or cane, or where many families might be crowded into one large communal tenement building, or where folk might even live in hillside caves. Though my own family's house was of only 3 rooms, it was even floored with smooth white limestone slabs. There were not many palaces in the one world that could pride themselves on being built of finer material. Our use of our stone for building meant also that our island was not denuded of its trees, as were so many other peopled places in the valley. In my time, our governor was Tlaka Chonsen, the Lord Red Heron, a man whose distant ancestors had been among the first Mexica settlers on the island, and the man who ranked highest among our local nobility. As was customary in most districts and communities, that guaranteed his lifetime tenure as Articutely, as representative of the speaking council headed by the revered speaker, and as ruler of the island, its quarries, its surrounding lake, and every single one of its inhabitants, except, in some measure, the priests, who maintained that they owed allegiance only to the gods. Not every community was so fortunate in its governor as was our Shantikan. A member of the nobility was expected to live up to his station, that is, to be noble, but not all of them were. And no pill born to the nobility could ever be demoted to any lower class, however ignoble his behavior. He could, however, if his conduct was inexcusable by his Pipiltan peers, be ousted from office or even put to death by them. I might also mention that, though most nobles get that way by being born to noble parents, it was not impossible for a mere commoner to win elevation to that upper class. I remember 2 Shantikan men who were raised from the Maquahualtan to the Pipiltan, and given an estimable lifetime income. Koladik Mistli, an elderly one-time warrior, had lived up to his name of fierce mountain lion by doing some great feat of arms in some forgotten war against some long-ago enemy. It had cost him such scars that he was gruesome to look at, but it had gained him the coveted sin suffix to his name, Mitsin, Lord Mountain Lion. The other man was Kwali Amayadal, or Good Fountain, a mild-mannered young architect who did no deed more notable than to design some gardens at the governor's palace. But Amayadal was as handsome as Mitsin was hideous, and during his work at the palace, he won the heart of a girl named Dewdrop, who happened to be the governor's daughter. When he married her, he became Amayatsin, the Lord Fountain. I have tried to make clear that our Lord Red Heron was genial and generous, but above all, he was a just man. When his own daughter Dewdrop tired of her low-born Lord Fountain, and was surprised in an adulterous act with a blood-born Peely, Red Heron commanded that both she and the man be put to death. Many of his other nobles petitioned that the young woman be spared her life, and instead be banished from the island. Even the husband swore that he forgave his wife's adultery, and that he and Dewdrop would remove to some far country. But the governor would not be swayed, though we all knew he loved that daughter very much. He said, "I would be called unjust if, for my own child, I should waive a law that is enforced against my subject people." And he said to Lord Fountain, "The people would someday maintain that you forgave my daughter out of deference to my office, and not of your own free will." And he commanded that every other woman and girl of Shantikan come to his palace and witness Dewdrop's execution. Especially all the nubile but unmarried maidens, he said, for their juices run high, and they might be inclined to sympathize with my daughter's dalliance, or even envy it. Let them be shocked at her dying, that they may dwell instead on the severity of the consequences. So my mother went to the execution, and took Tsitlini. On their return, my mother said the errant Dewdrop and her lover had been strangled, with cords disguised as garlands of flowers, and in full view of the populace, and that the young woman took her punishment badly, with terrors and pleas and struggling, and that her betrayed husband, Good Fountain, wept for her, but that the Lord Heron had watched without expression. Tsitsi said nothing of the spectacle. However, she told me of meeting at the palace the condemned woman's young brother, Red Heron's son, Packley. "He looked long at me," she said with a shudder, "and he smiled and bared his teeth. Can you believe such a thing, on such a day? It was a look that gave me gooseflesh." I would wager that Red Heron did no smiling that day. But you can understand why all the island folk so esteemed our impartially fair-minded governor. In truth, we all hoped the Lord Red Heron would live to a great age, for we regarded unhappily the prospect of being governed by that son, Packley. The name means joy, a misgiven name if ever there was one. He was an ill-natured and despotic brat long before he even wore the loincloth of manhood. That obnoxious offspring of a courtly father did not, of course, freely associate with any middle-class boys like myself and Tlotli and Shimali, and anyway was a year or two older. But, as my sister Tsitsi flowered into beauty, and Packley began to manifest increased interest in her, she and I came to share a special loathing of him. However, all that was still in the future. Meanwhile, ours was a prosperous and comfortable and untroubled community. We who had the good fortune to live there did not have to grind away our energies and spirits just for subsistence. We could look to horizons beyond our island, the heights above those to which we had been born. We could dream, as did my friends Chimali and Tlotli. Both their fathers were sculptors at the quarries, and those two boys, unlike myself, aspired to follow their father's trade of art, but more ambitiously than their fathers had done. "I want to be a better sculptor," said Tlotli, scraping away at a fragment of soft stone, which was actually beginning to resemble a falcon, the bird for which he was named. He went on, "The statues and friezes carved here on Shantikan go away in the big freighting canoes, unsigned, and their artists unacknowledged. Our fathers get no more credit for their work than a slave woman who weaves mats of the lake reeds. And why? Because the statues and ornaments we make here are as indistinguishable as those reed mats. Every Tlaloc, for example, looks exactly like every Tlaloc that has been sculptured on Shantikan since our fathers' fathers' fathers were carving them." I said, "Then they must be what the priests of Tlaloc want." "Nino Tlaloc in Tlamakaske," groaned Tlotli. "I pick my teeth at the priests. He could be as stolid and immovable as any stone figure. I intend to do sculptures different from all that have ever been done before, and no two, even of my own, will be alike. And all will be so recognizably my work that people will exclaim, 'Ayo, a statue by Tlotli.' I will not even have to sign them with my falcon symbol." "You want to do a work as fine as the Sunstone?" I suggested. "Finer than the Sunstone," he said stubbornly. "I pick my teeth at the Sunstone." And I thought that audacity indeed, for I had seen the Sunstone. But our mutual friend Chimali gazed toward even farther vistas than did Tlotli. He intended so to refine the art of painting that it would be independent of any sculpture underneath. He would be a painter of pictures on panels and murals on walls. "Oh, I will color Tlotli's lumpy statues for him, if he likes," said Shimali. "But sculpture requires only flat colors, since its shape and modeling gives the colors light and shade. Also, I am weary of the same old unvarying colors other painters and muralists use. I am trying to mix new kinds of my own, colors that I can modulate in tint and hue, so that the colors themselves give an illusion of depth. He made excited gestures, modeling the empty air. When you see my pictures, you will think they have shape and substance, even when they have none, when they have no more dimension than the panel itself. But to what purpose? I asked. Of what purpose is the shimmering beauty and form of a hummingbird? He demanded. Look, suppose yourself to be a priest of Tlaloc. Instead of dragging a huge statue of the rain god into a small temple room, and thereby cramping the room even more, the priests of Tlaloc can simply have me paint on a wall a portrait of the god as I imagine him to be, and with a limitless rain-swept landscape stretching away behind him. The room will seem immeasurably larger than it really is, and there is the advantage of thin, flat pictures over gross and bulky sculptures. Well, I said to Chamali, a shield usually is fairly thin and flat. I was making a joke. Chamali means shield, and Chamali himself was a lean and lanky boy. At my friend's ambitious plans and grandiose boasts, I smiled indulgently, or perhaps a little enviously, for they knew what they wanted eventually to be and do, and I did not. My mind had yet conceived no notion of its own, and no god had yet seen fit to send me a sign. I knew only two things for sure. One was that I did not want to hew and haul stone from a noisy, dusty, god-menaced quarry. The other was that, whatever career I essayed, I did not intend to pursue it on Shantikan or in any other provincial backwater. If the gods allowed, I would take my chances in the most challenging but potentially most rewarding place in the one world, in the Yue Tlatoani's own capital city, where the competition among ambitious men was most merciless, and where only the worthiest could rise to distinction, in the splendid, the wondrous, the awesome city of Tenochtitlan. If I did not yet know what my life work would be, I did at least know where, and I had known since my first and only visit there, the visit having been my father's gift to me on my 7th birthday, my naming day. Prior to that event, my parents, with me in tow, had gone to consult the island's resident tonal pokwe, or knower of the tonal model, the traditional naming book. After unfolding the layered pages to the book's full length, it took up most of his room's floor. The old seer gave prolonged and lip-moving scrutiny to its every mention of star patterns and godly doings relevant to the day's 7 flower, and the month God ascending, and the year 13 rabbit. Then he nodded, reverently refolded the book, accepted his fee, a bolt of fine cotton cloth, sprinkled me with his special dedicatory water, and proclaimed my name to be Shikome Shochido Tilektik Michli, to commemorate the storm that had attended my birth. I would henceforth formally be known as 7-Flower Dark Cloud, informally called Michli. I was sufficiently pleased with the name, a manly one, but I was not much impressed by the ritual of selecting it. Even at the age of 7, I, Dark Cloud, had some opinions of my own. I said out loud that anybody could have done it. I could have done it, and quicker and cheaper, at which I was sternly shushed. Early on the morning of the momentous birthday, I was taken to the palace, and the Lord Red Heron himself graciously and ceremoniously received us. He patted me on the head and said, with paternal good humor, "Another man grown to the glory of Shantikan, eh?" With his own hand he drew my name symbols, the 7 dots, the 3-petaled flower symbol, the clay-gray puffball signifying a dark cloud, and the Tokuyamaru, the official registry of all the island's inhabitants. My page would remain there as long as I lived on Shantikan, to be expunged only if I died or was banished for some monstrous crime or moved permanently elsewhere. I wonder, for how long has 7-flower dark clouds page been gone from that book? Ordinarily, there would have been a deal of other celebration on a naming day, as there had been on my sister's. All the neighbors and our relatives coming with gifts, my mother cooking and serving a grand spread of special foods, the men smoking tubes of pichiero, the old folks getting drunk on octally. But I did not mind missing all that, for my father had told me, "A cargo of temple friezes leaves today for Tenochtitlan, and there's room aboard for you and me. Also, word comes of a great ceremony to be held in the capital, the celebration of some new conquest or the like, and that will be your name-day festival, Weechley." So after no more than a congratulatory kiss on the cheek from my mother and my sister, I followed my father down to the quarry's loading dock. All our lakes bore a constant traffic of canoes, coming and going in all directions, like hordes of water striders. Most were the little 1- and 2-man accountant of fowlers or fishermen, made from a single gutted tree trunk and shaped like a bean pod. But others ranged upward in size to the giant 60-man war canoes, and our freight echelon consisted of 8 boats nearly that big, all lashed side by side. Our cargo of the carved limestone panels had been carefully piled aboard, each stone wrapped in heavy fiber mats for protection. With such a load on such an unwieldy craft, we naturally moved very slowly, though my father was one of more than 20 men paddling or pulling where the water was shallow. Owing to the curving route, southwest through Lake Shantikan, south into Lake Texcoco, thence southwest again to the city, we had to cover some 7 of the distances we called one long run, each of which would be approximately equivalent to one of your Spanish leagues. 7 leagues to go then, and our big scow seldom moved faster than a man can walk. We left the island well before midday, but it was well into the night when we tied up at Tenochtitlan. For a while, the view was nothing out of the ordinary. The red-tinted lake I knew so well. Then the land closed in on both sides as we slipped through the southern strait, and the water around us gradually paled to a dun color as we emerged into the vast lake of Texcoco. It stretched away so far to the east and south of us that the land yonder was only a dark, toothed smudge on the horizon. We crept southwest for a time, but Tonatiuh the sun was slowly cloaking himself in the radiance of his sleeping gown by the time our oarsmen backed water to bring our clumsy craft to a halt at the great dike. That barrier is a double palisade of tree trunks driven into the lake bottom, the space between the parallel rows of logs packed solid with earth and rock fill. Its purpose is to prevent lake waves, whipped up by the east wind, from flooding the low-lying island city. The great dike has gates set into it at intervals, and the dikemen keep those gates open in most weathers. But of course, the lake traffic headed for the capital is considerable, so our freighter had to wait a while in line before it could edge through the opening. As it did so, Tonatiuh drew the dark covers of night over his bed, and the sky went purple. The mountains to the west, directly ahead of us, looked suddenly as sharply outlined and dimensionless as if they had been cut from black paper. Above them, there was a shy twinkle, and then a bold spark of light. After Blossom, again assuring us that this was only one more of many nights, not the last and everlasting one. "Open wide your eyes now, son Meachley," called my father from his place at the oars. As if after Blossom had been a signal fire, a second light appeared, this one low beneath the jagged line of black mountains. Then there came another point of light, and another, and 20s upon 20s more. And thus I saw Tenochtitlan for the first time in my life. Not a city of stone towers, rich woodwork, and bright paint, but a city of light. As the lamps and lanterns and candles and torches were lit, in window openings, on the streets, along the canals, on building terraces and cornices and rooftops, the separate pinpoints of light became clusters. The clusters blended to form lines of light. The lines drew the outlines of the city. The buildings themselves, from that distance, were dark and indistinct of contour. But the lights, the lights. Yellow, white, red, jacinth, all the various colors of flame. Here and there a green or blue one, where some temple's altar fire had been sprinkled with salt or copper filings. And every one of those shining beads and clusters and bands of light shone twice, each having its brilliant reflection in the lake. Even the stone causeways that vault from the island to the mainland, even those wore lanterns on posts at intervals along their reach across the water. From our accolade, I could see only the two causeways going north and south from the city. Each looked like a slender, bright-jeweled chain across the throat of night, with the city displayed between them, a splendid, bright-jeweled pendant on the night's bosom. "Tenochtitlan, Chem Menahuac Tlali Yoloko," murmured my father. "It is truly the heart and center of the one world." I had been so transfixed with enchantment that I had not noticed him join me at the forward edge of our freighter. "Look long, son Meachley. You may experience this wonder and many other wonders more than once, but of first times there is always and forever only one." Without blinking or moving my eyes from the splendor we were all too slowly approaching, I lay prone on a fiber mat and stared until, I am ashamed to say, my eyelids closed of themselves and I fell asleep. I have no recollection of what must have been considerable noise and bustle and commotion when we landed, nor of my father's carrying me to a nearby inn for boatmen, where we stayed the night. I awoke on a pallet on the floor of an unremarkable room, where my father and a few other men lay still snoring on pallets of their own. Realizing that we were in an inn, and where that inn was, I leapt to lean out the window opening, and for a moment felt dizzy at seeing my altitude above the stone pavement below. It was the first time I had ever been inside a building atop a building, or that is what I thought it was, until my father later showed me, from the outside, that our room was on the upper floor of the inn. I lifted my eyes to the city beyond the dockside area. It shone, it pulsated, it glowed white in the early sunlight. It made me proud of our own home island, because what buildings were not constructed of white limestone were plastered white with gesso, and I knew that most of the material had come from Shantikan. Of course, the buildings were frescoed and inlaid with bands and panels of vividly colored paints and mosaics, but the dominant effect was of a city so white, so nearly silver, that it almost hurt my eyes. The lights of the night before were all extinguished now. Only a still smoldering temple fire somewhere sent a trail of smoke into the sky. But now I saw a new marvel. From the top of every roof, every temple, every palace in the city, from every highest eminence projected a flagpole, and from every staff flew a banner. They were not squared or triangular like battle ensigns. They were pennons many times longer than they were broad, and they were all white, except for the colored insignia they bore. Some of those I recognized, that of the city itself, of the revered speaker, Ashayakatl, of some gods, but others were unfamiliar to me, the symbols of local nobles and special city gods, I supposed. The flags of you white men are always swatches of cloth, often impressive in their elaborate blazonings, but still mere rags, which either hang limp on their staffs or flutter and snap peevishly like a country woman's washing hung to dry on cactus spines. By contrast, those incredibly long banners of Tenochtitlan were woven of feathers, feathers from which the quills had been removed, and only the lightest down used for the weaving. They were not painted or dyed. The flags were intricately woven of the feathers' natural colors, egret feathers for the white grounds of the flags, and for the designs the various reds of macaws and cardinals and parakeets, the various blues of jays and herons, the yellows of toucans and tanagers. Ayo, I tell you true, I kiss the earth. There were all the colors and iridescences that can come only from living nature, not from man-mixed paint pots. But most marvelous, those banners did not sag or flap. They floated. There was no wind that morning, just the movement of people on the streets and a Calton in the canals stirred enough air current to support those tremendous but almost weightless pennants. Like great birds unwilling to fly away, content to drift dreamily, the banners hung full spread on the air. The thousands of feather banners undulated gently, soundlessly, magically, over all the towers and pinnacles of that magic island city. By daring to lean perilously far out the window opening, I could see, away to the southeast, the two volcano peaks called Popocatépetl and Iztaccíhuatl, the incense-burning mountain and the White Woman. Though it was the start of the dry season and the days were warm, both the mountains were capped with white, the first snow I had ever seen, and the smoldering incense deep inside Popocatépetl wafted a blue plume of smoke that floated over him as lazily as the feather banners floated over Tenochtitlan. I hurried from the window to wake my father. He must have been weary and wanting sleep, but he arose without complaint, with a smile of understanding at my eagerness to be out and away. The unloading and delivery of our barge's cargo being the responsibility of its freight master, my father and I had the day to ourselves. He had one errand, to make some purchase my mother had ordered, I forget what. So we first wended our way northward into Tlatelolco. As you know, Reverend Friars, that portion of the island, what you now call Santiago, is separated from this southern part only by a broad canal crossed by several bridges. But Tlatelolco was for many years an independent city, with its own ruler, and it brashly kept trying to outdo Tenochtitlan as chief city of the Mexica. Tlatelolco's delusions of superiority were for a long time humorously tolerated by our revered speakers. But when that city's late ruler, Moquihuix, had the effrontery to build a temple pyramid higher than any in the four quarters of Tenochtitlan, the Yue Tlatoani Ashiacatl was justifiably annoyed. He ordered his sorcerers to harass that now intolerable neighbor. If the stories are true, a carved stone face on one wall of Moquihuix's throne room suddenly spoke to him. The remark was so insulting to his manhood that Moquihuix snatched up a war club and pulverized the carving. Then, when he went to bed with his first lady, the lips of her tepally parts also spoke to him, impugning his virility. Those occurrences, besides making Moquihuix impotent even with his concubines, much affrighted him. But still he would not cede allegiance to the revered speaker. So, earlier in that same year in which I made my naming day visit, Ashiacatl had taken Tlatelolco by force of arms. He himself, Ashiacatl, personally threw Moquihuix off the top of his upstart pyramid and dashed out his brains. And, just those few months later, by the time my father and I saw Tlatelolco, though it was still a fine city of temples and palaces and pyramids, it was satisfied to be the fifth quarter of Tenochtitlan, the city's marketplace appendage. Its immense open market area seemed to me to be as big as our whole island of Shantikan, and richer, and more full of people, and far noisier. Walkway aisles separated the area into squares, where the merchants laid out their wares on benches or ground cloths. And every square, or a square of squares, was allotted to a different kind of merchandise. There were sections for goldsmiths and silversmiths, for feather workers, for sellers of vegetables and condiments, of meat and live animals, of cloth and leather goods, of slaves and dogs, of pottery and copperware, of medicines and cosmetics, of rope and cord and thread, of vacuous birds and monkeys and other pets. Well, that market has been restored, and you have doubtless seen it. Though my father and I got there early in the morning, the place was already thronged with customers. Most were Machehualtan like us, but there were lords and ladies, too, imperiously pointing at the wares they wanted, and leaving the haggling of price to their accompanying servants. We were fortunate in arriving early, or at least I was, for there was one stall in the market which sold a commodity so perishable that it would be gone before mid-morning. The most distinctive delicacy among all the foods for sale. It was snow. It was brought in the 10 one-long runs from the crest of Iztaccíatl, by relays of swift messengers racing through the cool of the night, and the merchant kept it in thick clay jars under heaps of fiber mats. One serving of it cost 20 cocoa beans. That was an entire day's wage for the average workman anywhere in the Mexican nation. For 400 beans you could buy a passably strong and healthy slave for life. So snow was more expensive, by weight, than anything else in the Tlatelolco market, even the most costly jewelry of the goldsmith's stalls. Few but the nobles could afford a taste of that rare refreshment. Nevertheless, said the Snow Man, he always sold out his morning supply before it melted. My father made a token grumble. I remember the hard times. In the year 1 rabbit, the sky snowed snow for 6 days in a row. Snow was not just free for the taking, it was a calamity. But of course, he relented and said to the vendor, who could hardly have cared less, "Well, since it is the boy's naming day." He unslung his shoulder bag and counted out the 20 cocoa beans. The merchant examined each of them to make sure it was not a carved wood counterfeit or a hollowed-out bean weighted with dirt. Then he uncovered one of his jars, scooped out a spoonful of the precious delicacy, patted it into a cone made of a curled leaf, poured over it a dollop of some sweet syrup, and handed it to me. I took a greedy bite and nearly dropped it, so surprised was I at its coldness. It made my lower teeth and my forehead ache, but it was the most delicious thing I had eaten in my young life. I held it out for my father to taste. He lapped it once with his tongue, and obviously savored it as much as I did, but pretended he wanted no more. "Do not bite it, Meechly," he said. "Lick it, so it will last longer." When he had bought whatever it was my mother wanted, and had sent a porter carrying it to our boat, he and I went south again toward the center of the city. Although many of the ordinary buildings of Tenochtitlan were 2 and even 3 floors tall, and most of them made even taller for being set on pillars to avoid dampness, the island itself is nowhere more than 2 men's height above the waters of Lake Texcoco. So there were in those days almost as many canals as streets cutting up and down across the city. In places, a canal and a street ran side by side. The people walking could converse with the people afloat. At some corners we could see crowds of people bustling back and forth in front of us. At others we would see canoes gliding past. Some of those were passenger craft for hire, to whisk busy persons about the city more rapidly than they could walk. Others were the private accounting of nobles, and those were much painted and decorated, and held awnings aloft to ward off the sun. The streets were of hard-packed, smooth clay surfacing. The canals had masonry banks. In the many places where a canal's waters were almost at street level, its footbridges could be swiveled to one side while a boat passed. Just as the network of canals made Lake Texcoco practically a part of the city, so did the 3 main avenues make the city part of the mainland. Where those broad streets left the island, they became wide stone causeways, along which a man could walk to any of 5 different cities on the mainland, to the north, west, and south. There was another span which was not a walkway, but an aqueduct. It supported a trough of curved tiles, wider and deeper than a man's 2 arms could stretch. And this still brings to the city sweet water from the spring of Chapultepec on the mainland to the southwest. Since all the roads of the land and all the water routes of the lakes converged here at Tenochtitlan, my father and I watched a constant parade of the commerce of the Mexican nation, and of other nations as well. Everywhere about us were porters trudging under the weight of loads heaped on their backs and supported by 4-head tumplines. Everywhere there were canoes of all sizes, piled high with produce, going to and from the Tlatelolco market, or the tribute from subordinate peoples going to the palaces, the treasury, the national warehouses. Just the multicolored baskets of fruit would give an idea of the extent of the trade. There were guavas and custard apples from the Atomi lands to the north, pineapples from the Totonaca lands on the eastern sea, yellow papayas from Michoacan to the west, red papayas from Chiapan far to the south, and from the nearer south, Zapoteca lands, the Zapotecan marmalade plums, which gave that region its name. Also from the Zapoteca country came bags of the dried little insects which yield the several brilliant red dyes. From nearby Xochimilco came flowers and plants of more kinds than I could believe existed. From the far southern jungles came cages full of colorful birds, or bales of their feathers. From the hot lands both east and west came bags of cocoa for the making of chocolate, and the black orchid pods that make vanilla. From the southeastern coastland of the Olmeca came the product which gave that people their name, oli, strips of elastic gum to be braided into the hard balls used in our game of tlachtli. Even the rival nation of Tlaxcala, perennial enemy of us Mexica, sent its precious copali, the aromatic resin for making perfumes and incense. From everywhere came packs and panniers of maize and beans and cotton, and bundles of squawking live huachalome, the big, black, red-wattled birds you call galapagos, and baskets of their eggs, and cages of the barkless, hairless, edible tachichi dogs, and haunches of deer and rabbit and boar venison, and jars of the clear, sweet-water sap of the maguey plant, or the thicker white fermentation of that juice, the drunk-making drink called actli. My father was pointing out to me all those things, and telling me their names, when a voice interrupted him. For just 2 cocoa beans, my lord, I will tell of the roads and the days that lie beyond your son Meachly's name-day. My father turned. At his elbow, and not much taller than his elbow, stood a man who himself looked rather like a cocoa bean. He wore only a tattered and dirty loincloth, and his skin was the color of cocoa, a brown so dark it was almost purple. His face was creased and wrinkled like the bean. He might have been much taller at some time, but he had become bent and crouched and shrunken with an age no one could have estimated. Come to think of it, he must have looked much as I do now. He held out one monkey hand, palm up, and said again, "Only 2 beans, my lord." My father shook his head and said politely, "To learn of the future, I go to a far-seer." "Did you ever visit one of those seers?" the bent man asked, "and have him recognize you instantly as a master warrior from Shantikan?" My father looked surprised and blurted, "You are a seer. You do have the vision. Then why do I go about in rags with my hand out? Because I tell the truth, and people little value the truth. The seers eat the sacred mushrooms and dream dreams for you, because they can charge more for dreams. My lord, there is lime dust ingrained in your knuckles, but your palms are not calloused by a laborer's hammer or a sculptor's chisel. You see, the truth is so cheap, I can even give it away." I laughed, and so did my father, who said, "You are an amusing old trickster, but we have much to do elsewhere." "Wait," said the man insistently. He bent down to peer into my eyes, and he did not have to bend far. I stared straight back at him. It could be assumed that the mendicant old fraud had been lurking near us when my father brought bought me the flavored snow, and had overheard the mention of my significant 7th birthday, and had taken us for spendthrift rustics in the big city, easily to be gulled. But much later, when events made me strain to recall the exact words he spoke, ... He searched my eyes and murmured, "Any seer can look far along the roads and the days. Even if he sees something that will truly come to pass, it is safely remote in distance and time, and neither avails nor threatens the seer himself. But this boy's Denali is to look closely at the things and doings of this world, and see them near and plain, and know them for what they signify." He stood up. "It will seem at first a handicap, boy, but that kind of near-seeing could make you discern truths the far-seers overlook. If you were to take advantage of the talent, it could make you rich and great." My father sighed patiently and reached into his bag. "No, the man said to him. "I do not prophesy riches or fame for your son. I do not promise him the hand of a beautiful princess, or the founding of a distinguished lineage. The boy meekly will see the truth, yes. Unfortunately, he will also tell the truth he sees, and that more often brings calumny than reward. For such an ambiguous prediction, my lord, I ask no gratuity." "Take this anyway," said my father, pressing on him a single cocoa bean. "Just do not predict anything more for us, old man." In the center of the city there was little commercial traffic, but all the citizens not occupied with urgent business were beginning to congregate in the grand plaza for the ceremony of which my father had heard. He asked some passer-by what it was to be, and the man said, "Why, the dedication of the Sunstone, of course, to celebrate the annexation of Tlatelolco." Most of the people gathered were commoners like ourselves, but there were also enough Papilton there to have populated a sizable city of nobody but nobles. Anyway, my father and I had arrived early on purpose. Although there were already more people in the plaza than there are hairs on a rabbit, they nowhere near filled the vast area. We had room to move about and view the various sights to be seen. In those days, Tenochtitlan's central plaza, in Chaminahuac Yoyotli, the heart of the one world, was not of the mind-stunning splendor I would see on later visits. The snake wall had not yet been built to enclose the area. The revered speaker Ashayacatl was still living in the palace of his late father Moctezuma, while a new one was being built for him diagonally across the plaza. The new Great Pyramid, begun by that first Moctezuma, was still unfinished. Its sloping stone walls and serpent-banistered staircases ended well above our heads, and from inside could be seen poking the top of the earlier, smaller pyramid that was being thus enclosed and enlarged. But the plaza was already awesome enough to a country boy like me. My father told me that he had once crossed it in a straight line and paced it off, placing foot before foot, and that it measured almost exactly 600 of his feet. That whole immense space, some 600 man's feet from north to south and from east to west, was paved with marble, a stone whiter even than Shantikan's limestone, and it was polished as smooth and shiny as a Tezcatl mirror. Many people there that day, if their sandals were soled with one of the more slippery kinds of leather, had to take them off and walk barefoot. The city's 3 broadest avenues, each wide enough for 20 men to walk abreast, began there at the plaza and led out of it, north, west, and south, to become the 3 equally wide causeways going all the way to the mainland. The plaza itself was not then so full of temples and altars and monuments as it would be in later years, but there were already modest teocalli containing statues of the chief gods. There was already the elaborate rack on which were displayed the skulls of the more distinguished Xochimilque who had been sacrificed to one or another of those gods. There was the revered speaker's private ball court, in which were played special ritual games of tlachtli. There was also the House of Song, which contained comfortable quarters and practice studios for those foremost musicians, singers, and dancers who performed at religious festivals at the plaza. The House of Song was not, like all the other edifices on the plaza, entirely obliterated with the rest of the city. It was restored, and is now, until your cathedral church of San Francisco shall be completed, your Lord Bishop's temporary diocesan headquarters and residence. It is in one of the rooms of that House of Song that we now sit, my Lord Scribes. My father correctly supposed that a 7-year-old would hardly be enraptured by religious or architectural landmarks, so he took me to the sprawling building at the southeast corner of the plaza. That housed the UA Tlatoani's collection of wild animals and birds, and it too was not yet so extensive as it would be in later years. It had been begun by the late Montezuma, whose notion was to put on public display a specimen of the land and air creatures to be found in all the parts of all these lands. The building was divided into countless rooms, some mere cubicles, some large chambers, and troughs from a nearby canal kept a continuous flow of water, flushing out the room's waste matter. Each room opened onto the viewer's passageway, but was separated from it by netting, or in some cases, stout wooden bars. There was an individual room for each creature, or for those several kinds of creatures that could live together amicably. "Do they always make so much noise?" I shouted to my father, over the roaring and howling and screeching. "I do not know," he said, "but right now some of them are hungry, because they have deliberately not been fed for some time. There will be sacrifices at the ceremony, and the remains will be disposed of here, as meat for the jaguar and cougar cats, and the coyote wolves, and the sopalotan vultures." I was eyeing the largest animal native to our lands, the ugly and bulky and sluggish tapir. It waggled its prehensile snout at me, when a familiar voice said, "Master Quarrier, why do you not show the boy the Tequant Hall?" It was the bent brown man we had earlier met in the street. My father gave him an exasperated look and demanded, "Are you following us, old nuisance?" The man shrugged. "I merely dragged my ancient bones here to see the Sunstone dedication." Then he gestured to a closed door at the far end of the passage, and said to me, "In there, my boy, are sights indeed. Human animals, far more interesting than these mere brutes. A Tlaquetztali woman, for instance. Do you know what a Tlaquetztali is? A person dead white all over, skin and hair and all, except for her eyes, which are pink. And there is a dwarf with only half a head, who eats—" "Hush," my father said sternly. "This is a day for the boy to enjoy. I will not sicken him with the sight of those pitiful freaks." Ah, well, said the old man. Some do enjoy viewing the deformed and the mutilated. His eyes glittered at me. But they will still be there, young Meachley, when you are grown mature and superior enough to mock and tease them. I dare say there will be even more curiosities in the Tequani Hall by then, no doubt even more entertaining and edifying to you. Will you be silent? Bellowed my father. Pardon, my lord, said the hunched old man, hunching himself even smaller. Let me make amends for my impertinence. It is almost midday, and the ceremony will soon begin. If we go now and get good places, perhaps I can explain to you and the boy some things you might not otherwise understand. The plaza was now full to overflowing, and the people were shoulder to shoulder. We would never have got anywhere close to the Sunstone, except that more and more nobles were now haughtily arriving at the last moment, borne in gilded and upholstered litter chairs. The crowds of commoners and lower classes parted without a murmur to let them through, and the brown man audaciously yielded along behind them, with us behind him, until we were almost as far forward as the front ranks of real notables. I would still have been hemmed in without a view, but my father hoisted me to one shoulder. He looked down at our guide and said, I can lift you up too, old man. I thank you for your thoughtfulness, my lord, said that one, half smiling, but I am heavier than I look. The focus of all eyes was the Sunstone, set for the occasion on a terrace between the two broad staircases of the unfinished Great Pyramid. But it was shrouded from our sight with a mantle of shining white cotton. So I occupied myself with admiring the arriving nobles, for their litter chairs and their costumes were something to behold. The men and women alike wore mantles entirely woven of feathers, some vari-colored, some of just one coruscating hue. The ladies' hair was tinted purple, as was customary on such a day, and they held their hands high to display the bangled and festooned rings on their fingers. But the lords wore many more ornaments than their ladies. All had diadems or tassels of gold and rich feathers on their heads. Some wore gold medallions on neck chains, gold bracelets and armlets and anklets. Others wore ornate plugs of gold or jewels, piercing earlobes or nostrils or lower lips, or all of those. Here comes the High Treasurer, said our guide. Chiakotl, the Snake Woman, second in command to the revered speaker himself. I looked, eager to see a snake woman, which I assumed must be a creature like those human animals which I had not been allowed to look at. But it was just another Peely, and a man at that, distinguished only for being even more gorgeously attired than most of the other nobles. The labyrinth he wore was so heavy that it dragged his lower lip down in a pout. But it was a cunning labyrinth, a miniature serpent of gold, so fashioned that it wriggled and flickered its tiny tongue in and out as the Lord Treasurer bobbled along in his chair. Our guide laughed at me. He had seen my disappointment. The Snake Woman is merely a title, boy, not a description, he said. Every High Treasurer has always been called Chiakotl, though probably none of them could tell you why. My own theory is that it is because both snakes and women coil tight around any treasures they may hold. Then the crowd in the plaza, which had been murmurous, quieted all at once. The Uwe Tlatoani himself had appeared. He had somehow arrived unseen, or had been hidden somewhere beforehand. For now he suddenly stood beside the veiled Sunstone. Ashiakattle's visage was obscured by Labyrinth, nose-plug, and earplugs, and shadowed by the sunburst crown of scarlet macaw plumes that arched completely over his head from shoulder to shoulder. Not much of the rest of his body was visible either. His mantle of gold and green parrot feathers fell all the way to his feet. His chest bore a large and intricately worked medallion. His loincloth was of rich red leather. On his feet he wore sandals, apparently of solid gold, laced as high as his knees with gilded straps. By custom, all of us in the plaza should have greeted him with the tlalkolitzi, the gesture of kneeling, touching a finger to the earth and then to our lips. But there was simply no room for that. The crowd made a sort of loud sizzle of combined kissing sounds. The revered speaker, Ashiakattle, returned the greeting silently, nodding the spectacular scarlet feather crown, and raising aloft his mahogany and gold staff of office. He was surrounded by a horde of priests, who, with their filthy black garments, their dirt-encrusted black faces, and their blood-matted long hair, made a somber contrast to Ashiakattle's sartorial flamboyance. The revered speaker explained to us the significance of the Sunstone, while the priests chanted prayers and invocations every time he paused for breath. I cannot now remember Ashiakattle's words, and probably did not understand them all at the time. But the gist was this. While the Sunstone actually pictured the sun Tenactitlan, all honor paid to it would be shared with Tenochtitlan's chief god, Huitzilopochtli, Southern Hummingbird. I have already told how our gods could wear different aspects and names. Well, Tonatiuh was the sun, and the sun is indispensable, since all life on earth would perish without him. We of Shantikan and the peoples of many other communities were satisfied to worship him as the sun. However, it seemed obvious that the sun required nourishment to keep him strong, encouragement to keep him at his daily labors. And what could we give him more vitalizing and inspiriting than what he gave us? That is to say, human life itself. Hence the kindly sun god had the other aspect of the ferocious war god, Huitzilopochtli, who led us Meshika in all our battle forays to procure prisoners for that necessary sacrifice. It was in the stern guise of Huitzilopochtli that he was most revered here in Tenochtitlan, because it was here that all our wars were planned and declared, and the warriors mustered. Under yet another name, Tezcatlipoca, Smoldering Mirror, the sun was the chief god of our neighbor nation of the Akalhua. And I have come to suspect that innumerable other nations I have never visited, even nations beyond the sea across which you Spaniards came, must likewise worship that selfsame sun god, only calling him by some other name, according as they see him smile or frown. While the Uwe Tlatoani went on speaking, and the priests kept chanting in counterpoint, and a number of musicians began to play on flutes, notched bones, and skin drums, my father and I were privately getting the history of the Sunstone from our cocoa-brown old guide. Southeast of here is the country of the Chalka. When the late Moctezuma made a vassal nation of it, 22 years ago, the Chelca were of course obliged to make a noteworthy tribute offering to the victorious Mexica. 2 young Chelca brothers volunteered to make a monumental sculpture of peace, to be placed here at the heart of the one world. They chose similar stones, but different subjects, and they worked apart, and no one but each brother ever saw what he carved. Their wives sneaked a look, surely, said my father, who had that sort of wife. No one ever got a look, the old man repeated. During all those 22 years they worked to sculpture and paint the stones, in which time they grew middle-aged, and Moctezuma went to the afterworld. Then they muffled their finished works separately in swathings of fiber mats, and the lord of the Chelca conscripted perhaps 1,000 sturdy porters to hold the stones here to the capital. He waved toward the still shrouded object on the terrace above us. As you see, the Sunstone is immense, more than twice the height of 2 men, and ponderously heavy, the weight of 320 men together. The other stone was about the same. They were brought over rough trails, and no trails at all. They were rolled on log rollers, dragged on wooden skids, ferried over rivers on mighty rafts. Just think of the labor and the sweat and the broken bones, and the many men who fell dead when they could no longer stand the pull or the lashing whips of the overseers. Where is the other stone? I asked, but was ignored. At last, they came to the lakes of Chalco and Xochimilco, which they crossed on rafts, to the major causeway running north to Tenochtitlan. From there, it was a broad way and a straight one, no more than 2 one-long runs to the plaza here. The artists sighed with relief. They had worked so hard. So many other men had worked so hard. But those monuments were within sight of their destination. The crowd around us made a noise. The 20 or so men whose lifeblood would that day concentrate the Sunstone were in line, and the first of them was mounting the pyramid steps. He appeared to be no captured enemy warrior, just a stocky man, about my father's age, wearing only a clean white loincloth, looking haggard and unhappy. But he went willingly, unbound and without any guards impelling him. There on the terrace, he stood and looked stolidly out over the crowd, while the priests swung their smoking censers and did ritual things with their hands and staffs. Then one priest took hold of the Xochimilco, gently turned him, and helped him lie back on a block in front of the veiled monument. The block was a single knee-high stone, shaped rather like a miniature pyramid. So, when the man lay propped on it, his body arched and his chest thrust upward, as if eager for the blade. He lay lengthwise to our view, his arms and legs held by 4 assistant priests, and behind him stood the chief priest, the executioner, holding the wide, almost trowel-shaped black obsidian knife. Before the priest could move, the pinioned man raised his dangling head and said something. There were other words among those on the terrace. Then the priest handed his blade to Ashayakatl. The crowd made noises of surprise and puzzlement. That particular victim, for some reason, was to be granted the high honor of being dispatched by the Yue Tlatoani himself. Ashayakatl did not hesitate or fumble. As expertly as any priest, he stabbed the knife point into the man's chest on the left side, just under the nipple and between two ribs, then made a slash with the knife edge, then rotated the wide blade sideways to separate the ribs and open the wound wider. With his other hand he reached into the wet red opening, seized the unscratched and still beating heart, and tore it loose from its enlacement of blood vessels. Not until then did the Shochimikwi utter his first sound of pain, a blubbering sob, and the last sound of his life. As the revered speaker held high the glistening, dripping, purple-red object, a priest somewhere jerked some hidden string. The shroud fell away from the Sunstone, and the crowd gave a concerted "Ay-yo" of admiration. Ashayakatl turned, reached up, and ground the victim's heart into the very center of the circular stone, into the mouth of Tonatiuh carved there. He mashed and rubbed the heart until it was only a smear on the stone, and nothing was left in his hand. I have been told by priests and a heart's donor. I've been told by priests that a heart's donor usually lived long enough to see what became of his heart, but that one could not have seen much. When Ashayakatl was finished, the blood and ground meat were scarcely visible, because the carved sun face was already painted a color very like that of heart's blood. "That was cleanly done," said the bent man at my father's side. "I have often seen a heart go on beating so vigorously that it jumps from the executioner's fingers. But I think this particular heart had already been broken." Now the Shochimikwi lay unmoving, except that his skin twitched here and there, like the skin of a dog tormented by flies. The priests rolled his carcass from the stone and let it tumble unceremoniously off the terrace, while a second victim plodded up the stair. Ashayakatl honored no more of the Shochimikwe, but left the rest to the priests. As the procession went on, each man's extracted heart being used to anoint the Sunstone, I peered closely at the massive object, so I might describe it to my friend Tlotli, who, even way back then, had begun practicing to be a sculptor by whittling bits of wood into doll figures. Yo, Reverend Friars, if you could but have seen the Sunstone. Your faces showed disapproval of the dedication ceremony, but if you had ever once seen the stone, you would know it to have been worth all its cost in toil and years and human lives. The carving alone was beyond belief, for that was porphyry, a stone as hard as granite. In the center was the face of Tonatiuh, eyes staring, mouth agape, and on either side of his head were claws, grasping the human hearts which were his provender. Surrounding that were the symbols of the 4 eras of the world which preceded the era in which we now live, and a circle comprising the symbols of our 20-day names, and a circle of the alternating symbols of jadestone and turquoise, the gems held in highest esteem of all found in our lands. Around that, again, a circle of the day's sun rays alternating with the night's stars, and, girdling the whole, 2 sculptures of the fire serpent of time, their tails at the top of the stone, their bodies making the round of it, and their heads meeting at the bottom. In one stone, that one artist had captured all of our universe, all of our time. It was painted in bold colors, meticulously applied on those precise places where each color belonged. Yet the painter's real skill was most evident when no paint at all had been put on. Porphyry is a stone that holds fragments of mica, feldspar, and quartz. Wherever one of those bits of crystalline rock was embedded, the artist had left it unpainted. So, as the Sunstone stood in the midday radiance of Tonatiuh himself, those tiny clear jewels flashed at us pure sunlight from among the glowing colors. The entire great object seemed not so much colored as lighted from within, but I suppose you would have to have seen it in all its original glory to believe it, or through the clearer eyes and in the clearer light I enjoyed in those days, or perhaps with the mind of an impressionable and still benighted little heathen boy. Anyway, I turned my attention from the stone to our guide, who was continuing his interrupted history of the thing's painful progress hither. The causeway had never before known such a weight. The two brothers, two mighty stones, were moving along on their log rollers, one behind the other, when the road buckled under the leading burden, and that rapt stone went to the bottom of Lake Texcoco. The porters rolling the second, this Sunstone here, stopped it just short of the brink of the broken causeway. It was lowered onto a raft again, and floated around the island to the plaza here. Thus it alone was saved for us to admire today. But the other? Asked my father. After all that work spent, could not a little more have been expended? Oh, it was, my lord. The most experienced divers went down time after time, but the floor of Lake Texcoco is a soft and maybe bottomless ooze. The divers prodded with long poles, but they never located it. The stone, whatever it was, must have gone down edge on. Whatever it was? Echoed my father. No one but its artist ever laid eyes on it. No one ever will. It may have been more magnificent even than that. The old man indicated the Sunstone. But we will never know. Will not the artist tell? I asked. He never did. I persisted. Well, could he not do it over again? A task of 22 years seemed rather less to me than it would now. Perhaps he could, but he never will. He took the disaster as evidence of his tenali, as a sign that the gods had spurned his offering. That was he whom the revered speaker just now honored with the flowery death at his own hand. The rejected artist gave himself to the first sacrifice to the Sunstone. To his brother's work, my father murmured. Meanwhile, what of the brother? He will receive honors and rich gifts, and the sin to his name, said our guide. But the whole world will forever wonder, and so will he. Might there not be a work more sublime, even than the Sunstone, lying unseen beneath Lake Texcoco? In time, indeed, the myth-enhanced unknown came to be more treasured than the tangible reality. The lost sculpture came to be called in Huehuetoto, the most venerable stone, and the Sunstone regarded as only a middling substitute. The surviving brother never carved another work. He became an octly drunkard, a pitiful ruin. But he had enough self-respect remaining that, before he brought irredeemable shame to his new and noble title, he too volunteered to participate in a sacrificial ceremony. And when he died the flowery death, his heart did not either leap from the executioner's hand. Ah well, the Sunstone too has been lost and gone these 8 years now, buried under the rubble when the heart of the one world was demolished by your war boats and cannonballs and battering rams and fire arrows. But perhaps one day your own rebuilt new city of Mexico will be raised in its turn, and the Sunstone will be rediscovered shining among the ruins. Even Akin Ishnetla, perhaps some day the most venerable stone as well. My father and I went home again that night, on our composite alkali, now loaded with trade goods procured by the freight master. You have heard the major and most memorable events of that day, that celebration of my 7th birthday and naming day. It was, I think, the most enjoyable of all the birthdays I have passed, and I have passed more than my share. I am glad I got to see Tenochtitlan when I did, for I never again saw it the same way. I do not mean just because the city grew and changed, or because I came back to it surfeited and no longer impressionable. I mean I literally never saw anything so clearly again with my own 2 eyes. I have earlier spoken of my being able to discern the chiseled rabbit in the moon, and after blossom in the twilight sky, and the details of the insignia on Tenochtitlan's feather banners, and the intricacies of the Sunstone. Within 5 years after that 7th birthday, I could not have seen after blossom if some sky god had run a surveyor's string from the star to my eye. Metzli the moon, at his fullest and brightest, became no more than a featureless yellow-white blob, his once sharp circle fuzzing indistinctly into the sky. In brief, from about the age of 7 onward, I began to lose my sight. It made me something of a rarity, and not in any enviable sense. Except for those few born blind, or those who became so from a wound or a disease, almost all our people possessed the keen eyesight of eagles and vultures. My decreasingly clear vision was a condition practically unknown among us, and I was ashamed of it, and did not speak of it, and tried to keep it my own hurtful secret. When someone would point and say, "Look there," I would exclaim, "Ah, yes," though not knowing whether I should goggle or dodge. The dimness did not come upon me all at once. It came gradually, but inexorably. By the time I was 9 or 10, I could see as clearly as anyone, but only to a distance of perhaps 2 arms' length. Beyond that, the outline of things began to blur, as if I were seeing them through a transparent but distorting film of water. At a more considerable distance, say, looking from a hilltop across a landscape, all the individual outlines blurred so much that objects mingled and merged, and the landscape was to me no more than an eccentrically patterned blanket of amorphous smears of color. At least, in those years, with a clear visual field of 2 arms' length, I could move about without falling over things. When bidden to fetch something in one of the rooms of our house, I could find it without having to grope. But my scope of vision continued to diminish, down to perhaps 1 arm's length of clarity before I reached my 13th birthday, and I could no longer pretend well enough for it to go unnoticed by others. For a time, I suppose my family and friends thought me merely clumsy or slipshod, or maybe dim-witted. and at that time, with the perverse vanity of boyhood, I would rather have been thought a lout than a cripple. But it inevitably became obvious to everyone that I was lacking in the one most necessary of the five senses. My family and friends behaved variously toward this suddenly revealed freak among them. My mother blamed my condition on my father's side of the family. It seems there was once an uncle who, drunk on octally, had reached for another pot of some similarly white liquid, and had swallowed it all before noticing it was the most powerful caustic chocolate used for cleaning and bleaching badly begrimed limestone. He survived and never drank again, but he was blind all the rest of his life, and according to my mother's theory, that lamentable inheritance has been handed down to me. My father did no blaming or speculating, but counseled me rather too heartily. Well, being a master quarrier is close-up work, Beachley. You will have no trouble peering for the thread-like cracks and crevices. Those of my own age, and children, like scorpions, stab instinctively, savagely, would cry out to me, "Look there." I would squint and say, "Ah, yes. That is really something to see, is it not?" I would squint harder, desperately, and say, "It truly is." They would burst into laughter and yell derisively, "There is nothing there to see, Tozani." Others, my close friends, like Chimali and Plotley, would also sometimes blurt out, "Look there." But they would quickly add, "A swift messenger comes running toward the Lord Red Heron's palace. He wears the green mantle of good news. There must have been a victorious battle somewhere." My sister Tsitsitlini said little, but she contrived to accompany me whenever I had to go any distance or into unfamiliar surroundings. She would take my hand, as if merely making the fond gesture of an older sister, and unobtrusively she would guide me around any obstacles in my path not readily visible. However, the other children were so many, and they so persistently called me Tozani, that soon their elders addressed me the same, unthinkingly, not unkindly. And eventually so did everybody but my mother, father, and sister. Even when I had adapted to my handicap, and managed no longer to be so clumsy, and other people had little cause to notice my short-sightedness, by then the sobriquet had stuck. I thought that my given name of Meachley, meaning cloud, ironically suited me better than before, but Tozani I became. The Tozani is the little animal you call the mole, which prefers to spend its life underground, in the dark. When it infrequently emerges, it is blinded by the mere light of day, and squints its tiny eyes closed. It neither sees nor cares to see. I cared very much, and for a long time in my young life I went pitying myself. I would never become a Tlotchley ball player, to hope for the high honor of some day playing in the revered speaker's own court a ritual game dedicated to the gods. If I became a warrior, I could never hope to win knighthood. Indeed, I would be God-protected if I had a life expectancy of as much as one day in combat. As for earning a living, supporting a family of my own, well, a quarrier I would not become. But of what other labor was I capable? I toyed wistfully with the possibility of becoming some kind of traveling worker. That could take me eventually south to the far land of the Maya, and I had heard that the Maya physicians knew miraculous cures for even the most hopeless eye ailments. Perhaps there I could be healed, and could come home again in bright-eyed triumph, as an unbearable Tlachtli goldsman, or a battle hero, or even a knight of one of the three orders. But then the encroaching dimness seemed to slow its approach, and stop at my arm's length. It did not, really, but after those early years, its further progress was less perceptible. Today, with the unaided eye, I cannot make out my wife's face farther than a handspan from my own. It matters little, now that I am old, but it mattered much when I was young. Nevertheless, slowly I resigned myself and adapted myself to my limitations. That strange man in Tenochtitlan had spoken aright when he predicted that my Tenali was to look close, to see things near and plain. Of necessity, I slowed my pace. I was often still. I scrutinized instead of scanning. When others hurried, I waited. When others rushed, I moved with deliberation. I learned to differentiate between purposeful movement and mere motion, between action and mere activity. Where others, impatient, saw a village, I saw its people. Where others saw people, I saw persons. Where others glimpsed a stranger and nodded and listened on, I made sure to see him close, and later I could draw a picture of his every lineament, so that even an accomplished artist like Jamali would exclaim, "Why, Mole, you have caught the man, and to the life." I began to notice things that I think escape most people, keen-eyed though they may be. Did you ever notice, my lord scribes, that the maize grows faster at night than in the day? Did you ever notice that every ear of maize has an even number of rows of kernels, or almost every ear, but to find one with an odd number of rows is a happenstance far more rare than to find a clover leaf with 4 petals? Did you ever notice that no 2 fingers, no 2 of your own, no 2 in the entire human race, if my studies are any proof, have precisely the same pattern of whorls and arches infinitesimally etched on the balls of the fingertips? If you do not believe me, compare your own. Compare each other's. I will wait. Oh, I know there was no significance or profit in my noticing such things. They were but trivial details on which to exercise my new penchant for looking close and examining with care. But that necessity-made virtue, combined with my aptitude for copying exactly the things I could see, finally led me to take an interest in our people's picture writing. There was no school on Shantikan that taught such an abstruse subject, but I sought out every scrap of writing I could find, and studied it intently, and struggled to read its meaning. The numerical writing, I think, anyone could easily make out. The shell symbol for 0, the dots or fingers for 1s, the flags for 20s, the little trees for 100s. But I remember the thrill when one day I first puzzled out a picture word. My father took me along on some business visit to the governor, and, to keep me occupied while they talked in some private chamber, the governor let me sit in his entry hall and look at the register of all his subjects. I turned first to my own page. 7 dots, flower symbol, gray cloud. Then I ever so carefully moved to other pages. Some of the names were as easy to comprehend as my own, simply because I was familiar with them. Not far before my page was that of Jamali, and of course I recognized his. 3 fingers, the duck-billed head symbolizing the wind, the 2 intertwined tendrils representing smoke rising from a feather-fringed disc. Ye ehekadal pokua chimali, three-winged smoking shield. The more frequently repeated drawings were easy to espy. After all, we had only 20 day names. But I was suddenly struck by the not so immediately evident repetition of elements from Chimali's name and my own. One page near the back, hence recently drawn, showed 6 dots, then a shape like a tadpole standing on its head, then that duck-billed symbol, then the 3-petaled thing. I could read it. I knew whose it was. 6-rain wind flower, the baby sister of Tlotli, who had only last week celebrated her naming birthday. Somewhat less gingerly now, I turned the stiff folded pages back and forth, looking at the pages on both sides of the pleats, searching for other repetitions and recognizable symbols I could piece together. The governor and my father returned just after I had laboriously worked out another name, or believed I had. With a mixture of timidity and pride, I said, "Excuse me, Lord Red Heron, would you have the goodness to tell me, am I right? Does this page record the name of some person called Two-Reed Yellow Eye-Tooth?" He looked and said no, it did not. He must have seen my face fall, for he patiently explained. "It says Two-Reed Yellow Light, the name of a laundress here in the palace. The two-reed is obvious, and yellow, caustic, is easy to indicate simply by using that color, as you have divined. But Tlanach-Tolotl, light, or more precisely, the eyes element. How does one make a picture of something so insubstantial? Instead, I put a drawing of a tooth, Tlanti, to represent not the meaning, but the sound of the Tlan at the beginning of the word, and then a picture of an eye, Ish-Telolotl, which serves to make clear the meaning of the whole. You grasp it now? Tlanach-Tolotl, light." I nodded, feeling rather deflated and foolish. There was more to picture writing than just recognizing the drawing of a tooth. In case I had not realized it, the governor made it plain. Writing and reading are for those trained in such arts, son of Tepeztlan. And he gave me a man-to-man clap on the shoulder. They take much learning and much practice, and only the nobility have the leisure for such study. But I admire your initiative. Whatever occupation you do undertake, young man, you ought to do it well. I dare say the son of Tepeztlan should have complied with the Lord Red Heron's broad hint, and stuck to the trade of Tepeztlan. Weak-eyed and ill-equipped as I was for any more ambitious or venturesome occupations, I could have drudged away an uneventful but never empty-bellied life as a real mole of a quarrier. A life less satisfying, perhaps, than the one I stubbornly persisted in pursuing, but it would have brought me far smoother roads and more tranquil days than I was to know when I went my own way. Right at this moment, my lords, I could be employed in helping to build your city of Mexico. And if Red Heron was right in his estimation of my abilities, possibly making of it a better city than your own imported architects and stonemasons are doing. But let it pass. Let it all pass. As I myself let it all pass, heedless of the Lord Red Heron's implied command, heedless of my father's genuine pride in his trade and his attempts to teach it to me, heedless of my mother's carping complaints that I was reaching above my ordained station in life. For the governor had given me another hint, and one that I could not ignore. He had revealed that the picture writing did not always mean what it looked like, but what it sounded like. No more than that. But that was enlightening enough and tantalizing enough to keep me searching out bits of writing, on temple walls, on the island's tribute roll in the palace, on any paper carried by any passing tradesman, and doing my untaught, earnest best to make sense of them. I even went to the ancient Tonopokwi, who had so glibly given me my name 4 years before, and asked if I might pore over his venerable naming book when it was not in use. He could not have recoiled more violently if I had asked to use one of his granddaughters as a concubine when she was not otherwise busy. He repulsed me with the information that the art of knowing the tonal model was reserved for the descendants of Tonopokwe, not for unknown and presumptuous brats. It may have been so, but I will wager that either he remembered my declaring that I could have named myself as well as he had done, or, more likely, he was a frightened old fraud who could no more read the tonal model than I could at that time. Then, one evening, I met a stranger. Chimali and Tlotli and I and some other boys had been playing together all afternoon, so Tsitsitlini was not alone. On a shore far distant from our village, we found a old and rotting old hunk of an alkali, and got so absorbed in playing boatman that we were taken by surprise when Tonatiuh gave his red sky warning that he was preparing for bed. We had a long way to walk home, and Tonatiuh hurried to bed faster than we could walk, so the other boys broke into a trot. In daylight I could have kept up with them, but the dusk and my blighted vision forced me to move more slowly and pick my way with care. Probably the others never missed me. Anyway, they soon outdistanced me. I came to a crossroads, and there was a stone bench there. I had not passed that way in some time, but now I remembered that the bench bore several incised symbols, and I forgot everything else. I forgot that it was now almost too dark for me even to see the carvings, let alone decipher them. I forgot why the bench was there. I forgot all the lurking things that might descend on me as the night descended. I even heard an owl hoot somewhere nearby, and paid that omen of danger no attention. There was something there to read, or try to read, and I could not pass by without trying. The bench was long enough for a man to lie upon, if he could have lain comfortably on the ridges of stone carving. I bent over the marks, and stared at them, and traced them with my fingers as well as my eyes, and moved from one to the next and the next, and nearly sprawled across the lap of a man sitting there. I sprang away as if he had been red hot to the touch, and stammered an apology. Mishpan Cinco, in your august presence. Politely enough, but wearily, he made the customary reply. Shipo Natoro, at your convenience. Then we stared at each other for a space. I assume he saw only a slightly grubby, squinting boy of about 12 years old. I could not see him in detail, partly because the night was well upon us now, partly because I had leapt so far away from him, but I could make out that he was a stranger to the island, or at least to me, that his mantle was of good material, though travel-stained, that his sandals were worn from long walking, and that his coppery skin was dusty from the road. "What is your name, boy?" he asked at last. "Well, they call me Mole," I began. "I can believe that, but it is not your name." Before I could put in a word, he asked another question. "What were you doing just now?" "I was reading, Yankee-Kadzen. I really do not know what there was about him, but it made me address him as Lord Stranger. I was reading the writing on the bench." "Indeed," he said, in what sounded like tired disbelief. "I would never have taken you for an educated young noble. What does the writing say, then?" "It says, 'From the people of Shantikan, a resting place for the Lord Night Wind.'" Someone told you that. No, Lord Stranger. Excuse me, but, see? I moved close enough to point. This duckbill thing here stands for wind. It is not a duckbill, the man snapped. That is the trumpet through which the god blows the winds. Oh? Thank you for telling me, my lord. Anyway, it stands for Ehekatl. And this marking here, all these closed eyelids, that means Yowali. Yowali Ehekatl, the night wind. You really can read. A very little, my lord, not much. Who taught you? No one, Lord Stranger. There is no one on Shantikan to teach the art. It is a pity, for I should like to learn more. Then you must go elsewhere. I suppose so, my lord. I suggest you do it now. I tire of being read to. Go elsewhere, boy called Mole. Oh, yes, of course, Lord Stranger. Mishpatsinko. Shima Punolu. I turned back once for a last look at him, but he was beyond the range of my short sight, or he was swallowed up in the dark, or he had simply got up and gone. I was met at home by a chorus of my father, mother, and sister, expressing a mixture of worry, relief, consternation, and anger at my having stayed out so long alone in the perilous dark. But even my mother quieted when I told how I had been delayed by the inquisitive stranger. She quieted, and she and my sister looked with wide eyes at my father. He looked with wide eyes at me. You met him, my father said huskily. You met the god, and he let you go. The god Night Wind. All through a sleepless night I tried, without much success, to see the dusty, weary, surly wayfarer as a god. But if he had been Night Wind, then by tradition I was due to get my heart's desire. There was only one problem. Unless wanting to learn to read and write might qualify, I did not know what was my heart's desire, or I did not know until I got it, if that is what I got. It happened on a day when I was working at the first apprentice job I was given at my father's quarry. It was no onerous work. I had been appointed watchman of the big pit during the time when all the workmen downed tools and went home for their midday meal. Not that there was much risk of human thievery, but if the tools were left unguarded, small wild animals would come to gnaw the tool hafts and handles for the salt the wood had absorbed from the workers' sweat. A single prickly little boar could chew up a whole hard ebony pry bar during the men's absence. Fortunately, my mere presence there was sufficient to keep the salt-seeking creatures at bay, for whole swarms of them could have invaded unseen by my mole eyes. That day, as always, Tsitsitlini ran out from home to bring me my own midday meal. She kicked off her sandals and sat with me on the sunlit, grassy rim of the quarry, chattering gaily while I ate my fare of tiny, boned lake whitefish, each rolled and broiled in a tortilla. They had come wrapped in a cloth and were still hot from the fire. My sister looked warm too, I noticed, though the day was cool. Her face was flushed, and she kept fanning the square-cut top of her blouse away from her breasts. The fish rolls had a slight but unusually tart taste. I wondered if Tsitsi instead of our mother had prepared them, and whether she was chattering so volubly just to keep me from teasing her about her apparent lack of cooking skill. But the taste was not disagreeable, and I was hungry, and I felt quite replete when I had finished. Tsitsi suggested that I lie down and digest my meal in comfort. She would keep watch for any intruding, prickly little boars. I stretched out on my back and looked up at the clouds, which once I could see so clear-cut against the sky. Now they were but formless white swatches among formless blue swatches. I had got accustomed to that by now. But all at once, something more disturbing began to happen to my vision. The white and blue commenced swirling, slowly at first, then more rapidly, as if some god up there had begun to stir the sky with a chocolate beater. Surprised, I started to sit up, but I was suddenly so dizzy that I fell back upon the grass. I felt uncommonly odd, and I must have made some odd noise, for Tsitsi leaned over me and looked into my face. Addled though I was, I got the impression that she had been waiting for something to happen to me. The tip of her tongue was caught between her brilliant white teeth, and her narrowed eyes gave me a look of seeking some sign. Then her lips smiled mischievously, her tongue's tip licked them, and her eyes widened with a light almost of triumph. She remarked on my own eyes, and her voice seemed strangely to come like an echo from far away. "Your pupils have got so large, my brother." But she still smiled, so I felt no cause for alarm. "Your irises are scarcely brown at all, but almost entirely black. What do you see with those eyes?" "I see you, my sister," I said, and my voice was thick. "But somehow you look different. You look—" "Yes?" she prompted. "You look so beautiful," I said. I could not help saying it. Like every boy my age, I was expected to disdain and despise girls, if I even deigned to notice them. And of course one's own sister was more to be disparaged than any other girl. But I would have known Tsitsitlini to be beautiful, even if the fact had not been remarked so often in my hearing by all the adults, women and men alike, who caught their breath at first catching sight of her. No sculptor could have captured the lissome grace of her young body, for stone or clay cannot move, and she gave the illusion of being always in flowing motion, even when she was most still. No painter could have mixed the exact golden fawn color of her skin, or the color of her eyes, dough brown flecked with gold. But that day, something magical had been added, and that was why I could not refuse to acknowledge her beauty, even if I had been so inclined. The magic was visible all about her, an aura like that of the mist of water jewels in the sky when the sun comes out immediately after a rain. "There are colors," I said, in my curiously thickened voice. "Bands of color, like the mist of water jewels. All around your face, my sister. A glow of red, and outside that a glow of purple. And... Looking at me gives you pleasure?" she asked. "It does. You do. Yes. Pleasure. Then hush, my brother, and let yourself be given pleasure." I gasped. Her hand was underneath my mantle. And remember, I was nearly a year short of the age to wear a loincloth. I should have found my sister's bold gesture an outrageous violation of my privacy, except that somehow it did not seem so, and in any case I felt too numb to raise my arms and ward her off. I could feel almost nothing, except that I seemed to be growing in a part of my body where I had never noticeably grown before. So was Tsitsi's body changing. Her young breasts ordinarily showed only as modest mounds beneath her blouse, But now, as she knelt over me, her nipples were swollen. They poked like little fingertips against the thin cloth covering them. I managed to raise my heavy head and gazed blearily down at my tipuli in her manipulating hand. It had never before occurred to me that my member could be unsheathed of its skin so far down its length. That was the first time I'd ever seen more than the tip and the pouty little mouth of what was now, with its outer skin slid back, revealed to be a ruddy and bulbous-ended shaft. It looked rather like a gaudy mushroom sprouting from Tsitsi's tight grasp. "Weya yo katita," she murmured, her face almost as red as my member. "It grows. It becomes alive. See?" "Toton, tlapistia," I said breathlessly. "It becomes glowing hot." With her free hand, Tsitsi lifted her skirt and anxiously, fumblingly unwound her diaper-like undergarment. She had to spread her legs to get it entirely undone, and I saw her tipili, close enough that it was clear, even to my sight. Always before, there had been nothing between her legs but a sort of close-shut crease or dimple. And even that had been almost imperceptible, because it was blurred by a light fuzz of fine hairs. But now her cleft was opening of itself, like, Fray Domingo has upset and broken his inkwell, and now he leaves us, distressed by the accident, no doubt. During this interruption, I might mention that some of our men and women grow just a trace of imachli, which is that hair in that private place between the legs. But most of our race have no hair at all there, or anywhere else on the body, except for the luxuriant growth on the head. Even our men have only scant facial hair, and any abundance is regarded as a disfigurement. Mothers daily bathe their boy babies' faces with scalding hot lime water, and in most cases, as in my own, for example, that treatment discourages the emergence of a beard all through a man's life. Fray Domingo returns not. Do I wait, my lords, or go on? Very well. Then I return to that hilltop long ago and far away, where I lay dazed and wondering, while my sister worked so busily to take advantage of my condition. As I said, her tipili cleft was opening of itself, becoming a budding flower, showing pink petals against the flawless fawn skin there, and the petals even glistened as if drenched with dew. I fancied that Tsitsitlini's new-blossomed flower gave off a faint, musky fragrance like that of the marigold. And meanwhile, all about my sister, about her face and her body and her now uncovered parts, there still shimmered and pulsated those inexplicable bands and waves of various colors. She lifted my mantle out of her way, then raised one of her slender legs to sit astride my lower body. She moved urgently, but with the tremor of nervousness and inexperience. With one quivering small hand, she held and aimed my tipuli. With the other, she seemed to be trying to spread farther open the petals of her tipili flower. As I've told earlier, Tsitsi had already had some practice at utilizing a wooden spindle as she now utilized me, but she was still narrowed by her Chitoli membrane and was tight within. As for me, my tipuli was of course nowhere near man-size, though I know Tsitsi's ministrations helped to hurry it toward mature dimensions, or beyond, if other women have spoken true. Anyway, Tsitsi was still virginally pursed, and my member was at least larger than any thin spindle substitute. So there was a moment of anguished frustration. My sister's eyes were tight shut. She was breathing like a runner in a race. She was desperate for something to happen. I would have helped if I had known what it was supposed to be, and if I had not been so numbed in every part of my body except that one. Then, abruptly, the threshold gave way. Tsitsi and I cried out simultaneously. I in surprise, she in what might have been either pleasure or pain. To my vast amazement, and in what manner I still could not entirely comprehend, I was inside my sister, enveloped by her, warmed and moistened by her, and then gently massaged by her as she began to move her body up and down in a slow rhythm. I was overwhelmed by the sensation that spread from my warmly clenched and slowly stroked tipuli to every other part of my being. The mist of water jewels about my sister seemed to brighten and grow, to include me as well. I could feel it vibrating me and tingling me all over. My sister held more than that one small extension of myself. I felt totally absorbed into her, into Tsitsitlini, into the sound of small bells ringing. The delight increased until I thought I could no longer tolerate it. And then it culminated in a burst even more delicious, a sort of soft explosion, like that of the milkweed pod when it splits and flings its white fluffs to the wind. At the same moment, Tsitsi breathed out a long, soft moan of what even I, even in my ignorance, even half unconscious in my own sweet delirium, even I recognized as her rapturous release. Then she collapsed limply along the length of my body, and her long, soft hair billowed all about my face. We lay there for some time, both of us panting hard. I slowly became aware that the strange colors were fading and withdrawing, and that the sky above had stopped its whirling. Without raising her head to look at me, my sister said against my chest, very quietly and shyly, "Are you sorry, my brother?" "Sorry?" I exclaimed, and frightened the quail into flying up from the grass near us. "And we can do it again?" she murmured, still without looking at me. I thought about it. "Can it be done again?" I asked. The question was not so hilariously stupid as it sounds. I asked out of understandable ignorance. My member had slipped out of her, and was now wetly cold and as small as I had heretofore known it. I can hardly be derided for thinking that perhaps a male was allotted only one such experience in a lifetime. "I do not mean now," said Tsitsi. "The workmen will be returning." "But another day?" "Oh, every day, if we can." She lifted herself on her arms and looked down at my face, her lips again mischievously smiling. "I will not have to trick you next time?" "Trick me?" "The colors you saw, the dizziness and numbness. I did a most sinful thing, my brother. I stole one of the mushrooms from their urn in the Pyramid Temple, and cooked it into your fish rolls." She had done a daring and dangerous thing, besides a sinful one. The small black mushrooms were called Tiananakatl, flesh of the gods, which indicates how scarce and precious they were. They came, at great expense, from some holy mountain deep in the Mixteca lands, and they were to be eaten only by certain priests and professional seers, and then only on special occasions when it was necessary to foresee the future. Tsetse would assuredly have been killed on the spot if she had been caught filching one of the sacred things. No, do not ever do that again, I said. But why did you? Because I wanted to do what we just now did, and I was afraid you might resist if you knew clearly what we were doing. Would I have? I wonder. I did not resist then, nor any time afterward, and I found every subsequent experience just as blissful, even without the enhancement of colors and vertigo. Yes, my sister and I coupled countless times over the next years while I still lived at home, whenever we had the opportunity, during the mealtime break at the quarry, on deserted stretches of the lake shore, twice or thrice in our own house when both our parents were absent for what we knew would be an adequate while. We mutually learned not to be quite so awkward at the act, but of course we were both inexperienced. Neither of us would have thought of trying those transports with anyone else, so there was not a great deal we could teach each other. It was a long time before we even discovered that it could be done with me on top, though after that we invented numerous various positions. Now my sister slid off me and stretched luxuriously. Both our bellies were wet with a small smear of blood from the rupture of her jitotal, and with another liquid, my own amaketal, white like octli, but stickier. Tsetse dipped a wad of dry grass into the small jar of water she had brought with my meal, and washed us both clean, so that there should be no telltale trace on our clothes. Then she rewound her undergarment, rearranged her rumpled outer clothes, kissed me on the lips, said, "Thank you," which I should have thought of saying first, wrapped the water jar in its cloth, and ran off down the grassy slope, skipping merrily. There and then, my lord scribes, and thus ended the roads and the days of my childhood.